Andrea Fant Hobbs, and this is the South Orange Report. I'm delighted today to share with you information about our leaders and the life in South Orange. And our first guest is Alex Torpey, the 48th president of the Village of South Orange. So welcome, Alex. Thanks so much for joining us.
Sure. I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
The first thing I want to know, and I'm sure that our viewers want to know, is why do you want to become the president of the Village of South Orange?
Well, that's a good question. I suppose there are a whole lot of reasons. I think one of the things that, maybe two different sort of layers to wanting to get more involved. One was, in general, I think that people getting involved in what's happening in town. When I came back, I grew up in Maplewood, South Orange, and went to Columbia High School here, not too long ago. And when I came back home after school, I started to get involved, and I joined the Volunteer Rescue Squad in South Orange, and the Library Board, and a Citizens Public Safety Committee, and started to just kind of learn about how the government, worked here specifically, and just think that, that there's a real value to people getting more involved, learning about the process, and becoming, kind of active, constructive participants in trying to make the process better. One of the things that I saw at a certain point that I think is sort of maybe endemic of government in a lot of places is just that there was a little bit of a gap between what I felt like the government was doing and what people thought the government was doing. And that there were certainly a lot of great things that were happening in town, in some areas that I also thought we could improve on, but even the really great things that were happening didn't really feel like people knew that much about it. And so I thought that getting involved in a way that tried to be a little bit more open and accessible, and make myself available on social media and make myself available around town. People can usually still today find me down in Starbucks or somewhere in the downtown hanging out doing work, and I think that's important to kind of be out there that way and make sure that as best as possible people know what you're doing.
Yeah, transparency is really very important, and I think the more transparent the governance process is, the more empowered people feel to become involved and to actually get involved.
Mm-hmm.
So what exactly do you do on a day-to-day basis? What are the roles and responsibilities of the president of the village?
Well, every day is a little bit different. Part of it is also the balance between sort of the unpaid full-time job of being a village president and also, what would, pay your bills, my consulting company, or for a while, also being in graduate school. And so there's always this sort of tough balance on a day-to-day basis of figuring out, how do I kind of manage all these different pieces, and a good learning experience for anybody, and certainly it was for me. From the village standpoint, there's a lot of correspondence that happens, between myself and residents, whether that's over email, over social media, or in person. There's a lot of planning we do for the board meetings that happen twice a month. So the policies, ordinances, resolutions that are being considered for each meeting generally require a certain amount of staff work ahead of time. And then probably the biggest part, the most valuable role that I think the village president could play is being a sort of facilitator in the community. So that's going out and helping businesses work with each other, that's matching a resident to a community group, that's finding a new business and bringing them into town. So for example, I was invited to speak down in Washington, D.C., I guess it must have been last year, on a panel, and one of the other panelists was the president of Zipcar. And one of the things that I've always been really interested in is bringing better transit options to South Orange. We've got our amazing jitney. We've got a lot of people who commute. And from an environmental perspective and from a cost perspective, the more that we could do to share those resources, the better.
Yeah, the jitney is terrific.
Yeah, we love the jitney.
Both commuters, I see students hopping on the jitney to get to the South Orange train station. It's phenomenal. It's
great. And, one of the questions that a lot of people ask, if you're running for office, right, is what can you do about property taxes?
Yes.
And unfortunately, once you start whittling things down and realize that only 28% of the property taxes that we collect actually come back to us, and the rest goes to the school and county. Within that 28%, there's only a percentage that's discretionary, right? There are bills that we get for our insurance and for things like that, right? There are the contracts for our employees that are part of unions that are negotiated and kind of locked in on a multi-year basis. There are a lot of fixed costs. And you start getting down to it, you realize there's actually only a very small amount of money that you really have a huge influence over. So one of the things that I tried to do was think a little outside the box about it and say, well, it's not just the property taxes, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's not people's cost of living in South Orange. What is the total overall cost of living? And that includes transportation. And so if someone owns a car, but they only use it on the weekends to go every once in a while somewhere else because it's a 2-car family, if they're able to give up a second car and use car sharing, for example, I mean, that person could save $4,000, $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 a year, depending on what their car payments and insurance and gas and parking and all that is. So going outside of South Orange and talking about some of the technology initiatives that we were working on, and then meeting somebody and then bringing that back, that kind of chance meeting on that panel ended up bringing Zipcar to town.
So who's actually using the Zipcar? Because I've seen them parked outside of the firehouse, and they look adorable and efficient. I don't see anybody using them. I don't see them popping around town. So who exactly, do we know yet?
I think most of the times you're not going to see them around town. It's going to be people taking trips outside of town with them.
Okay.
So they're actually being used so heavily that Zipcar wants a third car in town.
Wonderful.
And so we should get some of those updated numbers on how many total trips have been taken. Many months ago when we first looked at it, I mean, it was in the hundreds in the first couple months. And so I think most of it is people, taking the car and then taking a trip somewhere outside of town, whether they're going to the mall or they're visiting someone, because around town, you could walk most of the downtown already. But it was just just kind of one example of, it's not a policy, right? But going out there and being kind of a someone to represent, an ambassador of South Orange, and bringing some of those resources back in that we might not otherwise have had access to, I think is one of the roles that someone in a mayor position should play. And so that's a big part of it.
That's terrific. And there's a lot going on in town. But before we talk about that, I want to know, during your campaign, politicians usually make some promises. So what promises have you kept? And which promises do you say, I'm still working on them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think most of the promises having to do with how we're going to try and reduce taxes and stabilize the budget we've done. We've had 3 years of the lowest tax increases since the 90s, and that's only going to get better this year as we start now to look at our budget for 2015. So I think that's been a big success, being more transparent about the budget. Our budget is online in a visual format that really is more, one of the most, if not the most transparent budget in the state. And so that was certainly a promise of making that process a little easier to understand and see. I think, exploring some of these transit options was a big part of it. And so figuring out how to sustain and expand the jitney service, which would be great. Ideally, trying to figure out a way to kind of merge that with the Seton Hall shuttle service, so that we don't have two different systems, but it's one, which is just very complicated because of the contracts that people already entered into. Those were a big part of it. As far as public safety and crime has gone down, every year in the past 3 years. We've invested a lot more resources back into our police department, especially through technology.
Yes, I was going to ask, how is technology being leveraged to make the town safer, to make us more efficient, to make life in town better?
It's amazing because one of the things about technology is I think that IT at one point was kind of its own sort of department, and now IT is in every department. Right, so it's a department and it's also kind of a meta department. And so one good example of that is that we have a mobile app called SO Connect, which is run through a company called Public Stuff, and that you can access through your mobile phone or from the website at southorange.org/311. And from that you can submit basically complaints or feedback to the village. So a pothole, a street light out, a gas lamp out, a noise complaint, graffiti, a code issue.
We have noise complaints in South Orange.
Yeah, only a few. Only when I'm having loud parties. Yeah. And so that's a great example because that helps, that creates a much more efficient system for us, right? Rather than keep track of it in email, which everybody gets too many emails these days. They're not well organized. So now we have it in a system where you get a ticket number and there's accountability for us because now someone can say, I submitted ticket 0572 on this day, why isn't it done yet? And now I can enter that number in and go see exactly the history of what staff person it went to, who worked on it, who didn't work on it. And so that's been a great success. We've had somewhere between almost 1,700 submissions come through there, and hopefully that number will only increase.
Let me talk about the tickets for a hot second. We want to encourage people to come downtown, to do business downtown, to shop downtown. We have our lovely parking meters, and I've heard so many complaints about the meters not all working, but then the time limit seems so terribly short, and our very good friends in parking enforcement are chomping at the bit to give tickets. Talk a little bit about the feeling or the intention there, because we can go from incenting people to come and then upsetting people with being so tenacious about the ticketing.
So there's two different kind of areas that I can answer that.
And where's the forgiveness? I guess the question is there any forgiveness in there?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would certainly encourage people. I'll say that one of the things that happens after you get elected to office is people come to you with parking ticket complaints. I don't think I've ever taken a single one personally and basically tell people, if you feel like you got the ticket and there was something wrong about it, you should contact them.
Great.
Especially if the meter was broken, and they should be flexible about that. Now, if it was just I forgot to put money in the meter, I mean, it is unfortunate, but that's not necessarily something worth undoing the ticket. However, if there was broken equipment or something like that, should absolutely contact the parking authority and have them take a look at that. Now, one of the things is that, interestingly, in New Jersey, state law allows for 3 different types of parking organizations. You could have a parking department, a parking utility, or a parking authority. And they're each different legal entities, and they each have different pros and cons to what they're allowed to do.
Sure.
So the parking authority, for example, is the most autonomous type. So they have their own budget, they have their own staff, they have their own board members, and they're really responsible for kind of setting the policy and the direction of all the parking services in town. Now, that being said, one of the benefits with having a parking authority is that the organization is able to bond. So, for example, in a town like New Brunswick, where they're doing a lot of redevelopment, the parking authority will do their own bonding that's not on the municipal books, it's not on the taxpayer rolls necessarily, it's kind of on a separate budget, and that allows them to do more redevelopment. However, we have ours set up in a very weird way, so they don't own any property, so they can't bond. So it's a very odd setup, and I think one of the things that the Board of Trustees is talking about, and that we've set as a goal for 2015, is that the parking authority has really grown into a transit department.
Yes.
Right? They manage the jitneys. They are a kind of liaison with Zipcar with the car sharing. They work with New Jersey Transit a little bit, and they do the parking. And so maybe it's time to reevaluate, kind of how that's organized and make sure that it kind of fits the best, mold of, what we want it to be. The other way that I was going to answer that, although I'm sure I've answered this too long already, is that part of the idea of having shorter meters in the middle of the downtown is to try and encourage people to do longer term parking further away and then walk to the downtown, and keep the meters right around the stores just for coming in, picking up, and dropping off stuff.
Well, we are going to take a break in a few minutes, and when we come back, I want to talk about what's happening in town, new parking opportunities, new businesses, and how do we incent those new businesses to come to town.
Right.
So this is the South Orange Report. I'm Andrea Fant Hobbs, and stay tuned because we will be right back.
Television is a powerful and influential medium that allows different groups the opportunity to produce programming that directly affects their own communities. Public, educational, and government access channels ensure that all people, regardless of race, age, gender, disability, religion, or economic status, have access to local government information and the use of a public communication forum. Make sure everyone has a voice. Support your local PEG channels.
Welcome back to the South Orange Report. I'm Andrea Fant Hobbs, and my guest this evening is Alex Torpey, the 48th president of the Village of South Orange. So, Alex, I want to get back to a couple of things. I think you were sharing what promises you've kept. What promises are you still working on?
Well, I think that there's a couple areas like the transparency, for instance, or the budget. I mean, those are never. I mean, I wouldn't say that there are promises to keep or not keep. It's kind of a constant,
ongoing.
Yeah, it's an evolving. I mean, we've done really great work with the budget, but we could do better. We've made, I think, what we do in town more accessible to people more than it ever has been, and more than most towns that I've ever seen, and certainly for New Jersey. But we could certainly do better. And so I think that with each of these things, it's more, and I would love to, sort of take the focus off any individual elected officials' goals and put them, and this is one of the things that I instituted when I came in, was having a goal-setting meeting for the governing body, where we're all going to get together and we're going to agree on what our government's goals are. And that's something that's obviously done in the private sector, right, in the nonprofit sector. It's not always done in government. And so, as people go, what I think you actually might find in some places is basically politicians trying to keep promises that they made. And
it requires a much larger group of people.
It does, that's right. And buy-in from the whole group, and that the goals are not about one person or not, but they're about, what's the government, what can we accomplish as a group? And so those goals, I think, are really important.
So if we think about the goal of continuing to create vitality downtown, attracting new businesses, I want to talk a little bit about what's going on in town. There's a lot of construction happening, and people have polarizing views about the oughtness of what should come to town, what kinds of businesses should come to town. Should we be developing these multi-unit dwellings? Are they good for the village, or are they not? Can you talk a little bit about what's coming?
Sure.
Why what's coming is good for the town, and are we proactively attracting businesses, or are they discovering that South Orange is terrific and they're knocking on our door? So start with what's happening.
Sure. There's a lot happening. We've got the Gateway projects on South Orange Ave that just opened up. We've got Third and Valley. You can sort of see it just moving along very quickly. There's 2 other development opportunities that we've identified just on South Orange Ave. And then we're also looking now at Irvington Ave in a little bit more detail than we have before. So we're going to see a lot more of this, and hopefully it will continue to be, kind of LEED certified sustainable development. The reason why we're doing all of this is because it brings a larger rateable base into the town, into the budget. With Third and Valley, for example, we turned a parking lot into not only a place where 215 people, more than that, 215 apartments will exist. So 250, 300 people will now be able to call South Orange their home who couldn't have done so before, which is amazing. And we're bringing in retail.
And what's your thought regarding how that's really going to change the bucolic nature of this village?
Well, I think that there's a huge emphasis that we have to place on the aesthetics of the buildings that we're doing.
Yes.
And Third and Valley, Jonathan Rowe's company, they did an unbelievable job in getting exactly, kind of what we wanted architecturally speaking. So a lot of what the building features, it's hard to tell now as they're kind of putting the concrete up, but it's got some of the kind of iconic old Victorian-looking towers that some of, the Firehouse has or the Village Hall has or some of the houses in Montrose, and they tried to match that as much as possible.
Good. So we're not talking about just steel behemoths.
Oh, definitely. This is like brick outside, this is brick facades. These are, when we went through the approvals for their buildings, we're going down to the details in the moldings on the window. It is very, very specific and very much supposed to look like it fits well into South Orange, and hopefully it will.
Great, that's important. And so we're hoping that these new residents will be contributing to the lifeblood of town. So
they're going to be contributing to the local businesses downtown because they're going to be within walking distance of so many of them. They're going to be contributing culturally to South Orange. That's one of the things that makes this community so amazing.
But what about the congestion? Those are the good things for sure. But what about the congestion? I'm thinking about that intersection of the Gateway. That's a very busy intersection with our wonderful partner, SOPAC, one of the jewels in the crown of South Orange. Are we not concerned, or have we? What's our plan for the congestion?
Well, most of the people who are going to be living in these apartments are going to be commuting by train. So you're always, of course, going to find some people that are going to be doing it by car. So the problems that we would have where you're adding cars at the busiest times, and there's an enormous amount of traffic studies that have to be done to even legally allow these projects to be built. And everything has to come within under certain thresholds, or they have to redo the intersections. So, for example, at Third and Valley, the intersection is on Third and Valley is being redone, which is a really bad one right now. It's not timed correctly. It doesn't change for time of day. There's not a turning lane where there should be. So those things will actually be improved with some of these projects coming in.
Wonderful.
But so part of the idea is that you're adding people, but so one of the variables that we use in redevelopment is the parking ratio, right? Is how many parking spots you have to build per residential unit. And if you go farther and farther back in time, you might look at 1.7, 1.6, 1.8 parking spaces per unit. And now what we're trying to get to for everything is basically 1-to-1. So the Gateway, for example, is 1-to-1. So the concept is that we're bringing less cars, and the people who are moving in are
more foot traffic.
And more train focused. So they may use their car, but they're not going to be doing it consistently every day during the peak times where there's already congestion.
Okay, wait a minute. So it sounds like we've thought through the car congestion.
Mm-hmm.
What about the train congestion?
The train congestion
for
is
many years into the city.
Great question.
And actually began living in the village just as the Midtown Direct came on board, which was fabulous.
Mm-hmm.
Knowing how crowded the train was back then when it got to South Orange, adding all the new development, which is great. These will be commuters. They'll be contributing to town. What will the commuters be experiencing as a result of the many, many bodies?
Yeah, it's going to get crunched. I think over the long term, maybe not the next development, but 2 from now, 3 from now, 4 from now, it's definitely going to get crunched. And and in the past, we've had people get frustrated with the town. We obviously don't have control over that. People get frustrated with New Jersey Transit. They don't have control over it either, right? They don't own the train tracks. Mm-hmm. They don't decide whether to build a tunnel to New York City or not. They're a service provider. And even though we've had some issues with them as far as notifying us about scheduling changes, making sure that we're getting all the double-decker trains we can get,
yes.
So maximize whatever capacity you can do. But when we had problems with New Jersey Transit changing the schedules, we sat down with everybody from New Jersey Transit we could sit down with, including the person who does the schedules, and we looked at during rush hour, and they are booked down to pretty much the second on train track time in and out of Penn Station during rush hour. And there's no space to add. You can't even elongate the trains and add cars on because there's a minimum safe distance, right? You have to keep between each of the trains. So the problem isn't even with New Jersey Transit. I think the problem is with the state of New Jersey, with the state of New York, with the Port Authority, and with the federal government, and that they're not providing resources to commuters. We're adding lanes onto highways, and yet we're not providing funding for transit.
So the net is, people will just have to be a little closer to their neighbors on the train.
Everybody's going to get to know each other. I mean, I don't think we're going to have major problems. I think during peak times it might be crowded, but I don't think we're going to have consistent problems every single day in the near future. I mean, there are already delay issues. There's already overcrowding issues sometimes with the New Jersey Transit trains. But again,
hopefully people will believe that returning to such a lovely village at the end of their work day is worth it.
That's right.
I want to ask you about what new businesses are coming. So we talked about the real estate development and why that could be a good thing for the village. What businesses are coming? We've got Zipcar. What else is coming?
That's a big part of this is in that we're now being much more intentional and proactive about going out and trying to get new businesses to come in. One of the things.
So what do we want? Are we going to get a bed and breakfast in?
I would love to see the bed and breakfast. I think that the business model there is tough. Because they have to figure out a way to get the rooms filled at a certain percentage throughout the rest of the year when there's not major events happening in Seton Hall. I would love to see that, and that's these conversations. We're going out. So one of the conversations we're having right now is I would love to see a co-working space where we provided basically a business incubator for entrepreneurs. I think we have a lot of entrepreneurs that live in town, and we've got a great business school at Seton Hall. And we could provide a lot better space and support for them. And so, that's me literally tweeting at people and asking them if I could take them on a tour of South Orange. And we're building some really good relationships that way. For example, on South Orange Ave, we've got a couple new businesses coming in. D&I Fitness, which is on Scotland right now, they're moving into a bigger space. We're also bringing Mars Cafe and Bakery, which is almost like a Panera, but kind of more locally owned. Okay. And there's a few locations. I think the first one was in Denville, and they're coming to one of the spaces in the Gateway, and that's an amazing. It's like a cafe, bakery. They do sandwiches, salads, paninis, coffee.
What will be happening with the former Blockbuster space? Do we have any exciting business takers for that location?
Well, one of the things that we're doing right now is looking at that entire block as far as redevelopment is concerned. The blockbuster space is a bit of a tough one. We've gotten it.
Parking must be an issue for
The
that.
parking and bringing in, one of the things that we really do need in town is we need like one or two big names. Right? That doesn't mean bring a Walmart to the middle of town, but it does mean bring a brand name that people are familiar with.
Yes.
Because what you can
So what do we need to be doing to create incentive for that one name to come? And I know we only have about 3 minutes left, so I really want to get to this one because this is a big issue.
We need to do a couple
get that
things.
big anchor
Yeah.
business.
Parking is a big issue, and so all the development projects that we're doing, we're only looking at projects that add a significant amount of parking to the town through a parking deck.
Okay.
So that's important.
So that's
2 is
building
better
up.
spaces. Like the blockbuster space right now, it's got multi-levels. It's kind of a weird construction. There's some of the spaces are not designed and laid out that well for the kind of businesses we would want to bring. There's not outdoor seating right outside of it. The sidewalk's kind of narrow there. So part of what we need to do is make sure that the physical spaces are ready to accommodate the kind of business that we want. And another one, which is another thing that we're doing now, is reviewing our municipal code to make sure that we don't actually outlaw certain businesses, which we actually currently do now.
Yes.
In an effort to keep fast food out of town, the way some of the codes are written is they don't actually allow a place like a high-end fast food, like a Panera or Chipotle or Qdoba. Those are not actually, depending on exactly how you interpret the law, they're not actually allowed in town. And so we need to review our municipal codes and make sure that we're providing incentive for business owners. So one of the things we did was we now allow businesses to keep their furniture outside overnight. If they keep it out of the walkway, we reduced the cost for them to apply for the permit to have the furniture outside, and by reducing all of those costs, now people are buying better furniture.
Great.
And the better furniture that you can't take wrought iron furniture in and out every night. So now that they're allowed to keep it outside, they have the money to buy the furniture, the incentive to buy it, and now they're actually doing it. And we have more businesses with outdoor furniture this year since we made those changes than we've ever had in years before. And so sometimes it's just being very tactical, finding the policy issue, fixing it, providing the incentive, and the businesses will react accordingly.
Great, because I know that we are really looking forward to getting that anchor business in town. We talked about transparency being really important in the governance process, and transparency inspiring people to participate in a passionate way in town. What do people need to do that want to really get involved in the governance of town or committees? Where should they go? Who should they call?
It's amazing. And anybody can call me, find me anytime. My email is atorpey@southorange.org. That's an easy one.
And you have a special spot in the local coffee shop.
That's right. You can find me around town. We're trying to completely revamp the way that we manage and incentivize volunteers, because I think we all agree we don't do a good enough job of basically matching people up with where their interests are, what skills they have, to where we need help. But still, with that process being worked out better, there's still amazing volunteer opportunities in town, whether it's on the rescue squad, whether it's on the community emergency response team, whether it's with the library board, whether it's with the Historic Preservation Commission, whether it's on the planning board. We've got tons of statutory committees and boards. We've got a lot of more issues-focused groups like the Irvington Ave Advisory Committee that's doing a lot of looking at and researching on that business corridor. So there's a million ways for people to get involved.
So people can find you.
They should. If
find
anybody
you.
has questions or interests, any time of day, someone can come talk to me, and we'll find the right place for them to get involved.
Great. Thank you very much for coming to the South Orange Report, and I'm sure we'll have to have you back because there's so much more we haven't covered.
That sounds great.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.